it's not actually.
All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started at 6 o'clock. And first, of course, I want to just thank all of you for coming out tonight. It's a great crowd after a holiday. Good to see you all. My name is Greg Kimball. I'm the Director of Public Services and Outreach here at the Library of Virginia. Just a little bit of housekeeping. There are cards you can fill out on the program. We love to get evaluation of our programs and particularly know where you heard about the program. That helps us plan our marketing. So please fill those out if you get a chance. We'd love to hear from you. Also, I want to just announce our next book talk on August 22nd. I believe she's with us tonight, Allison Taylor White. Yes, we'll be speaking on a wonderful new book about Shockoe Hill Cemetery that she has written and has just been published. So we look forward to that. Also, to remind you that Jon will be signing books. They'll be available in the shop after the lecture, so please pick up a copy of this very, very fine biography. I want to just quickly introduce our interviewer and interviewee. We have with us Sarah McConnell, who many of you know, of course, from With Good Reason, production of the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities. She's formerly a news director of WINA in Charlottesville, and she's done a lot of work with social justice organizations and other organizations, including being a co-founder of Computers for Kids. She served on the boards of Offender Aid and Restoration, Children, Youth, and Family Services, the Emily Corrick Leadership Forum, the Virginia Association Press Broadcasters, and a number of other organizations. So we're delighted to have her with us tonight to host our conversation. So give her a big round. And the interviewee is a good friend of the library and former member of the library staff, Jon Kukla, who many of you probably know from a wide range of publications that he has authored. He is a very fine American historian author. He served, I think it's important, he's someone who's moved back and forth between what we call public history, if you want to put it that way, and more academic writing. He has published a number of really fine books. A Wilderness So Immense, a wonderful book about the Louisiana Purchase. I love the title, Mr. Jefferson's Women, in 2009. And any number of other titles that but I won't bore you because we want to get to the main event here. The book has gotten just amazing reviews, and rightly so. I know there's a really great blurb by an old professor of mine at UVA who is quite a Jefferson scholar. Jon also shared with me a really fine Publishers Weekly review. It kind of summarizes how well he does both writing for the average person and citizen, as well as for a scholarly audience. This is from Publishers Weekly. Kukla's fluid prose and careful attention to detail ensure that this biography will appeal to both general readers interested in the Founding Fathers and scholars interested in learning more about the development of the early republic. It's been a long time since it's been a really good, solid biography of Henry, so this is really an important book. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Sarah and to Jon. Thank you.
Is this on?
Yeah, we can hear you.
What?
We can hear you.
Yeah. This is such a terrific book. I was thinking as I started to dive into it that it should be, if not required reading, it should be terrific reading for every member of the legislature. It's a wonderful view of the earliest politics, shenanigans, and sort of state of how people thought and were in early Virginia.
You're very kind. Couldn't do him any harm.
I want to get into the amazing resolutions that Jefferson scribbled on the back of a piece of paper for the standback. But before that, you open the book with a just incredible scene, a poignant scene of Patrick Henry about to die. And his doctor, Cabell of Lynchburg, has said, here's a potion, I want you to drink this. It's liquid mercury. We hope that what will happen is the blockage in your intestines because mercury is heavier than lead, maybe it'll just push on through. And Jefferson says calmly to the doctor, Henry says, what will happen after I drink this?
Yeah, and Cabell says it will either cure you or, and then at that point he's unable to finish the sentence. And as the accounts of this goes, he goes outside and basically throws himself on the lawn and sobs unmercifully while Henry sits in his little house at Red Hill, looking out the window at his law office, watching the blood congeal under his fingernails, talking to his, to his children and such, and ultimately, apparently, from a clinical point of view, apparently what happens with mercury poisoning is that it constricts the lungs, and so he died because it didn't work. The weight of it didn't work. When I was at Red Hill, one of the visitors one day was a nurse, and she said, "Well, my gosh, we still do that, but we put it in plastic."
One question we debated in my family was, had it ever worked?
Yeah.
But also, before he died, he'd gotten his affairs together, and he especially wanted people to read, after his death, a letter to America.
Yes.
And on the other side of the paper were the 7 resolutions he had sketched out to oppose the king in the Stamp Act.
Yeah, Henry recognized, as most of his contemporaries would have recognized at that time in the 18th century, that the Stamp Act was the event in which the American colonies became unified and defined their constitutional argument with Great Britain. And he recognized, as did many of his contemporaries, that the Virginia resolutions against the Stamp Act were absolutely instrumental. It's one of the stories that's kind of fun to tell in the book, is that I track through a diarist the way in which because this diarist was traveling in Virginia and then into Maryland and up into almost to Philadelphia, I think. You can just sort of follow with him the spread of the resolutions as the people in Maryland get all excited about them and so on. And the Virginia resolutions against the Stamp Act really do help all of the other colonies. So Henry wrote that down on one side of that piece of paper, and on the other side, he's got this note to posterity. Basically, he poses the question as to whether the revolution and independence is a good or a bad thing. And he says the answer will be determined by basically what Americans do with this opportunity. And if they are virtuous and good, it'll be fine, and if not, it'll be catastrophic. And so therefore his advice to posterity is to practice virtue and encourage it in others.
He was so young when he scribbled those 7.
Yeah, 29.
He was 29, a brand new member of the House of Burgesses.
Yeah, 5 days.
So at some point, the Stamp Act, you write, was actually much more onerous than I realized. I thought we were just opposed to the taxes in principle, but there were incredible taxes on light and transient things.
Yeah, decks of cards. They had devised a stamp that could be stamped onto dice to try to tax those. Now, as a number of people, even at the time, argued, the Stamp Act was in many ways really stupid. Among other things, what they taxed was newspapers and every single advertisement within a newspaper and all kinds of legal documents. So basically, hey, let's impose taxes on the Americans and piss off the printers and the lawyers. That's a good idea.
Freedom of the press.
And this young Patrick Henry was this speech in Williamsburg at the House of Burgesses, where he just lets them have it. And a young Jefferson is 17 years old, you write, listening at the door saying, oh my God, this man.
Yeah. At that time, Jefferson was much enamored of Henry, and his is an interesting commentary, because of course one of the problems with Henry's entire career is that we didn't have CNN there, taping the speeches. So a lot of things that he said are lost in the ether. But in the case of the Caesar Brutus speech, Jefferson remembers and writes down the fact that that Henry made that reference to what was it? Caesar had his Brutus, Charles III Charles I had his Cromwell, and George III, and then there's this pause as the speaker shouts treason, and Henry says may profit by their example. And Jefferson affirms that there was that kind of that something close to that happened, but of course we don't have a tape, so there we are.
He had 7, and each of the 7 was just more injurious to the king than the last.
Yes.
And you write that he shrewdly decided to stop at 5, because the last 2 are real zingers.
Yes.
They were already calling him treasonous by 5. And yet, after this passed, because of his eloquence and fire and passion and conviction, when he rode back to, was it Louisa at the time, at the end of the session,
Mm-hmm.
Jefferson sees one of the other lawmakers start to look up a clause that will nullify all the resolutions that they just passed, or at least one of them.
Right. So what they're able to do the next day, after Henry has gone home, is they're able basically to rescind the 5th of the ones that were passed. So on the official record of the House of Burgesses, there are 4 resolutions that were passed, and the 5th one is expunged. And then obviously Governor Fauquier put pressure on Joseph Royal, who was then the editor of the Virginia Gazette, not to publish any of this stuff, which kept it from being published in the Virginia Gazette, but unfortunately, unexpected consequences. It meant that all 7 resolutions got circulated elsewhere, first published in Rhode Island, then in Maryland, and throughout the colonies. And so all of a sudden, Virginia looked way more radical than, in fact, the Virginia legislature had been prepared to be.
I loved reading this. Peppered throughout this period after Jefferson, he really does get accused of treason by the Virginia speaker and shuts him down. But as radical as that was, the other 2 resolutions were even more radical. People throughout New England and up and down the East Coast were so thrilled with Jefferson that they would toast the Virginians wherever they met, in bars and tavern houses. New England toasted to the men of Virginia. Others said to the Virginia Assembly. Boston said, they are men, they are noble spirits. New England said to the brave Virginians.
Yep.
Maryland raised their glasses to the Virginia Assembly and damnation to the Stamp Act.
Yeah.
Wow. Those are the days.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that will enable me to make friends in Boston.
but it was this speech that really galvanized America's opposition to the king and to the Stamp Act and started to bind the colonies together.
Yeah, I think so. I think his speech helped get the resolutions passed. The resolutions have a ripple effect as they go through the various colonies, and then ultimately the Parliament backs down, and in a year later rescinds the Stamp Act, passes a declaratory act saying that they have the authority to legislate for the colonies, but in fact they back down on the Stamp Act.
How popular now is Patrick Henry at that time among his compatriots in Louisa and the region?
He's very popular. He's very, very popular at home. Of course, some of that popularity was won in the Parsons cause in 1763. So he started off very, claimed by his people, but he's popular at home. There are some old guard Virginians who are a little bit suspicious of this young man that they don't have under their thumb. And among those, Edmund Pendleton, I think, is the one who, Pendleton lives to 1808. Pendleton, very much like Henry, a young man from Caroline County, from a sort of lower gentry background, makes his way as an attorney. But Pendleton sort of signs on with the conservative forces, and is, among other things, he's the executor to Speaker John Robinson, who was the one who was famously caught up in all kinds of fraud and recycling of state money. So the two of them sort of run a parallel course through their careers. And Pendleton is always suspicious that Henry is a demagogue, and Henry he's always polite, but he's not really comfortable with Pendleton. And I'll tell you secretly that one of the things that would make me very, very happy, let's say 20 or 30 years from now, is if this book were to replace David Mays's Pendleton as the go-to book for the story of the Revolution.
So if we worked our way backwards, we would say that Henry's father had come from Scotland.
Yes.
And his uncle was a minister. Henry's father, on Sunday morning, you write, would gallop off to the established Anglican church. His mother would take him to the firebrand, the renegade minister of Pole Green Church,
Right.
where he really absorbed so much of the eloquence, the passion, and the fire.
Yeah, Henry clearly, and I'm not the first person to say this, lots of people have, notably Rhys Isaac in his scholarship several decades ago, that Henry clearly joined the rhetorical style of the evangelical New Light ministers basically with the political ideals of the 18th century Virginians. And I think as I put it in the book, the result was revolutionary.
Well, he made a failed attempt fairly young to be a storekeeper. And when several things didn't work, he decided to get a law license. And he did this, you say, in a very unconventional way, and brought some snickering and consternation on the part of the, erudite lawmen.
Mm-hmm. The common practice for somebody who wanted to go become a lawyer would have been to essentially apprentice themselves to an established attorney and learn and read law with that attorney and figure out how things work. Henry instead basically read law by himself. The record is unclear as to how long he did this. Jefferson occasionally will say, "Oh, he did it for 4 weeks." Nobody quite knows. But in the end, he had studied law long enough so that he went to, and of course he was at this time living at Hanover Courthouse, right across the street, and probably talking to. And there's a lawyer from Louisa that seems to have been influential in his life at this point too. But at any rate, he goes down to do what you had to do, which was basically be examined by members of a committee of lawyers who practiced in front of the General Court, the Supreme Court of the colony, and he did that and was admitted to the bar under the promise, basically, that he'd do more reading.
One of them, there were several big names in history.
Yeah, it's John Randolph, Attorney General, Peyton Randolph, then Speaker of the House of Burgesses, George Wythe, who later goes on to become the first law professor, and I think it's Robert Garner Nicholas, maybe the fourth. I'm fuzzy on the fourth right at the moment. But
And one of them sort of has this Socratic back and forth for hours.
yeah, that's John Randolph, the Attorney General, later a loyalist, and he has a conversation with Henry, and at some point in their conversation, they're in Randolph's library, and at some point he starts egging Henry on with questions, and basically makes an argument that is fraudulent, and he knows it. And Henry answers him back and basically reasons with him, and Randolph finally admits that, you're right. I've been putting, I just sort of trying it out. You need, and basically what he says at that point is that he recognized his raw intellect, and also recognized, as did Henry, the need to keep reading.
He did not go to college and he didn't go to law school.
That's right. He, by all accounts, basically he studied with his father, who was who we could say a graduate of the University of Aberdeen, but apparently the practice in 18th century Scotland, this is so different from today, so different from today. The practice in 18th century Scotland, he went to 4 years of college. He would have had to pay an extra fee to get a diploma. Who needs a diploma? I got the education. So he never actually technically graduated. And apparently this is what 18th century Scots did, which was basically go there, learn, and who gives a damn about the sheepskin, which costs extra. And of course nowadays you can go online and buy sheepskins that are meaningless. But yeah, he studied with his father. Seems to have known some Greek, certainly knew some Latin, and a friend of mine, Kevin Hayes, a couple of years ago, did a book that University Press of Virginia published called The Mind of a Patriot, in which he studied Henry's library and really documented the fact that that Henry was much more of an intellect than particularly Jefferson was willing to. Jefferson liked to say that he couldn't read, that he never read anything, that he couldn't write, And of course, from the, Henry was a very, very successful trial lawyer. So he's arguing in front of Virginia county juries. He's a bunch of damn farmers. I like farmers, by the way. I grew up. They don't want to hear all kind of pontificating about the law and learning and stuff. And so I think it's absolutely natural that Henry would play down his learning. And in fact, in some of the instances in which we have some testimony to this, that basically, he's going to play good old boy and shucks and all that. I think a lot of times he's like Columbo, when he starts off with and apparently this was the way he did speeches. He'd start off kind of slow, looking around, reading his notes, and then the part that that everybody loves about everybody who's a Henry fan loves is that apparently he would oftentimes do this with his glasses on, and he's looking at his notes. And all the while, one of the things that's interesting that I learned about Henry that I didn't know about Henry is we all think of him as a great orator. He was part of the secret of that is he was a really, really good listener. Mm-hmm. And so he would banter with people in social settings and figure out where they are, and with a jury, he'd mumble around until he started to get some sort of rapport and know which way to make the argument, and he was dynamite when he did it. And then was at some point the oratory would start, and it's at that point the glasses went up. And the descriptions of this, Mark Cuvion has published a number of descriptions of people's accounts of Henry as an orator. I mean, it's like it's a transformer. He's a man of average height, I think, a little bit stoop-shouldered. You know, the pictures of him. This is not Robert Redford. This is Patrick Henry. The pictures of him are of an ordinary, little bit swarthy, complected guy. But apparently, when the glasses went up into the war camp, they called it, he just was transformed, and he went to full height, and just it seems to have been just an absolutely amazing thing to witness.
And it was only in recent years I've even heard of this famous case that preceded the Stamp Act attack called the Parsons Cause at the Hanover Courthouse, and a lot of you real students of Jefferson, of Patrick Henry already know about it. But this is a very young man. How old is he then? Just a couple years into his practice.
Yeah, just a couple years into practice.
You're right that he rode around and he got clients.
26 maybe?
26.
Yeah.
And his uncle is a member of the established Anglican church, and he sees his uncle outside of the courthouse, and he said, "Uncle, get out of here. You're going to ruin me, because I'm going to say things that'll make your hair curl about you and the established church." And then he makes an incredible argument, so powerful that later people of Louisa are carrying him around on their shoulders.
Yeah.
They're so thrilled. And he's defended their right not to have to pay their minister at a time when they've got nothing.
Yeah.
Ish.
Yeah.
In a nutshell.
In a nutshell, yeah. Yeah, that's a great. That's what really propels him into political life, and again, as in all the instances in which his oratory comes to bear, he's using the rhetorical style that we associate with Samuel Davies and the New Light or Great Awakening preachers. He's using their rhetorical style, and particularly at one point Samuel Davies talks about how you, as a preacher, his responsibility is not to make an argument, not to make a logical argument, but to convict your soul, to make an emotional argument that brings you to the right conclusion. It's not anti-intellectual in the sense that he doesn't believe in the argument, in the intellectual argument. But his responsibility as a preacher is to try to persuade you to embrace this. Henry does exactly the same thing, and in the Parsons Cause, basically, the arguments that he's put forward are all the ones that Richard Bland and Langdon Carter had put forward in pamphlets in the arguments over the Stamp Act controversy. So it's that merging of the Great Awakening rhetorical style with the constitutional legal positions that are just mainstream 18th century Virginia.
He had such a big footprint in Virginia. He was born and then lived in so many different places that a lot of us can lay claim to him. And then later, he rode through the far western and southern portions to inspect land. He later accumulated thousands of acres. But would you briefly tell us all the different counties he represented or lived in?
Good. Henry lived in 12 different places. He died at 63, so that's about, five years in each. Several of them in Hanover. There seems to be, I was the director down at Red Hill, his last home, and where he's buried, which is in Charlotte County, just right at the Campbell County line, looking across the Stanton River into Halifax. He loved that place, and that whole area down there, Campbell and Charlotte. There's a whole lot of people that seem to have come down from Hanover. So I think, if we were able to do a lot of family histories, we'd probably see that there were folks, including some Presbyterians who were in Charlotte and Campbell as early as 1745, so that they're kind of connected to the Hanover folks. He had apparently contracted malaria when he was governor of Virginia in Williamsburg, and so throughout the rest of his life, he preferred not to be in Tidewater and to be up in higher ground, basically.
Did he live in Louisa and Goochland and Hanover?
He lived in Louisa. I don't think Goochland He lived in, well, he lived in the governor's palace. He lived, of course, at Scotchtown. I think probably if his wife had not died at Scotchtown, I suspect he would have stayed there happily. But once it was associated in his mind and heart with her death, he sold Scotchtown and moved into the governor's palace in Williamsburg while he was there. Later, he lived down in Salisbury, which is now the site of a country club down in. He lived in Prince Edward for a while, and then in Campbell and Long Island and Charlottesville, and then down in I forget, Patriot or Henry, I forget, down near Martinsville, at a plantation called Leatherwood.
How vast was his reputation in his day? I think we now think, yay, Patrick Henry, liberty or death, but really you could almost do no wrong.
He had, well, I think if we want to take the testimony of George Washington in terms of Henry's influence in the legislature, Washington at one point, not entirely happily, said he has only to say, let this be law, and it will be law. Yeah, he was enormously influential, and I think he embodied a kind of a vision of a kind of Virginia country lawyer, the hegemony of, if you will, of the county courts in Virginia politics. He embodied all of that sort of tradition in a way that that certainly made his reputation, live on into the 19th century. He retired from politics he was retired from politics by 1792, but interestingly, after Washington announced that he was that he was not going to seek a third term as president, there were a number of people, Alexander Hamilton prominently among them, who were trying to recruit Henry to run for president. At that time, under the original electoral college, whoever got the second number of votes would become the vice president, which is why we ended up with John Adams being president and Thomas Jefferson being vice president in Adams's administration. So he was seen, in other words, in 1796, he was seen as a character of national significance. Henry wouldn't let himself be played by the politics, by the emerging political parties, and basically published a letter in the newspapers, which was reprinted throughout the colonies, saying, I don't vote for me. I don't want to be president. I withdraw from this. So he didn't want to be a spoiler to take votes away from somebody else for the purposes of machinations.
He and Washington were about exactly the same age. Jefferson much younger. One of my favorite moments, this is not an important moment, and yet it's a very telling one, when Jefferson was again about 17, he's at a Christmas party where Patrick Henry is. Patrick Henry is what, 15 years older?
Let's see. Henry is 36, 36. Jefferson is 43. So it's about, what's that math? 7 years? 7 years. I think 7 or 8 years, yeah.
But Jefferson...
But in your teens, that's a big difference.
But you're right that Jefferson was really annoyed because Patrick Henry was popular and surrounded by people at the party and just convivially engaging in conversation. And Jefferson wanted to talk science.
Yeah. Which is, the way that we all get forward in Christmas parties. Yeah.
It just shows you how different these men were.
They were. Their temperaments are just so extremely different, and unfortunately that's part of the reason that they had such a falling out. Henry was used to the rough and tumble of not only politics but of the law. He'd riding the circuit with other lawyers. You'd have to argue against them in court. You might argue against the lawyer in one court and have in the next case that afternoon, you might be on the same side. Then you go on to the next court where you're going to argue against him again, but you have to stop at some ordinary and possibly end up sleeping in the same bed. So Henry was accustomed to, and certainly in the legislature, he was accustomed to the rough and tumble of politics, and to basically, not letting it get under his skin. Jefferson was much more thin-skinned until, we all have this image of Jefferson, the president, as being this sort of philosopher king who was above it all. But certainly during the 1780s, he was much more thin-skinned, and he took the criticism of his behavior as governor very deeply, and believed Henry was behind it. And so they had a falling out in 1781 after the British had invaded Virginia. And I've never been able to find evidence that the two of them were in one another's presence after that. But clearly, from that point forward, and I kind of think that, I kind of think that Jefferson nurtured or held a grudge that Henry may not have been aware of, because the worst thing that we have recorded by Henry saying something ugly about any of his contemporaries. Yes, it said some ugly things about George III, but that's okay. But the worst thing that he said about Thomas Jefferson was that Jefferson had abjured his native victuals because he had a French chef.
I should share the mic with everybody with questions, but I have to ask you, I was stunned by and appreciated your description of how he was on slavery. So first I want to know, did his father have slaves when he was growing up? I know he inherited some when he married. He married at 18 a 16-year-old woman who was, in Virginia society to some extent. But he later is seen by the Quakers as a reasonable, caring, moral man, a godly man who surely hates slavery. And Jefferson repeatedly says he hates it, it's abominable, it's against God, we're going to all pay for this. But I wrote this down because it was this. He was keenly aware of how much slavery and ownership of slaves harmed his message of freedom from tyranny and the king. He admitted slavery was awful, but said, I am drawn along by the inconvenience of living here without them. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. One of the things that I'm kind of proud of accomplishing in this book is documenting Henry's attitudes towards slavery more thoroughly than anyone has previously done. And partially that's because I got into some records of a greater amount of his correspondence with the really fascinating Richmond area abolitionist and Quaker, Robert Pleasance. His papers are, Pleasant's letters are at the Huntington and also at Haverford College, and there are microfilm copies upstairs here that you can get into. But basically in a nutshell, what I was able to sketch for Henry and on the subject of slavery is that born in 1736, so he's growing up in Hanover in 1740s, early 50s, at a time when his uncle and Samuel Davies, the Presbyterian and the Anglican minister, are both preaching the same point of view, which is that slavery is a perfectly acceptable thing. It's in the Bible, after all. But it's important as slave owners that you should treat your slaves decently. Now, by 1773, Henry is writing in a letter that's widely published, and in fact it gets republished a lot during the antebellum period, where American abolitionists are trying to turn Henry into one of them. He writes in a letter to Pleasance in 1773, that slavery is abhorrent and that it's evil and that there's, it cannot be justified, and yet I have slaves. One of the things I respect about Henry in regard to slavery is his candor. He says, I have slaves of my own purchase. This wasn't one of the Tidewater families who were saying, oh gosh, I don't know, I inherited them from my grandfather, what can I do? This was, I am complicit in slavery, and yet it is wrong, it cannot be justified. Subsequently, I'm able to track his attitudes towards slavery up into the 1790s and the change of attitudes that was widespread throughout the South in reaction to the Haitian Revolution and the kind of hardening of positions there. And the irony is basically by this time, Henry is essentially saying it's wrong, but I don't know what to do with it, and all we can do is treat them well. So you've gone from mid-century, there's nothing wrong with slavery, but you should treat them like human beings, to slavery is a horrible thing, but you should treat them like human beings. That may not seem like much of an advance, but I like to point out that Henry and his generation, by declaring slavery to be evil, which is something that the antebellum defenders of slavery don't do. Henry and his generation, slavery is evil, and therefore there's a sense in which they set the standard by which we measure their failure to do something about it.
Who among you has questions? There are mics on either side.
Yeah, you could come either to one of these microphones to ask questions. Somebody have questions for the panel? Yes, sir. Come on up here. Just make sure everybody can hear.
Well, it was a very entertaining talk, and I think we all learned a lot. You mentioned earlier on about the Virginia resolutions, where they came from. I wonder if you could make a couple more comments about that, because, I mean, the reputation Patrick had was that he was, probably Jefferson spread it, that he was so lazy, but he wrote these insightful resolutions that spread across the colonies, you said, but he didn't actually invent them, did he? I mean, he found them in other places.
Yeah, thank you. The arguments that he puts forward in those resolutions against the Stamp Act, I think have two sources. One is the pamphlet debate over the Parsons Cause, and particularly the pamphlets that Richard Bland and Carter had written from 1760 to 1763, and then the last one of Bland's pamphlets comes out in 1765, I think, but it had been circulated in manuscript. So that's one source. But the other source that I think Henry draws upon for his Stamp Act resolutions is the initial reaction to the Stamp Act that the legislature, a committee of the legislature, had made prior to his election. And one of the stories I tell in the book is the first time Henry goes to Williamsburg. Well, the second time. First time is when he's being when he has to pass the bar. But the second time he goes to Williamsburg, he is representing his friend Nathaniel Dandridge in a contested election case, and basically has several days in Williamsburg where he's wandering around the Capitol. And we have a testimony from somebody who saw this, not very well dressed young man looking like he was out of place wandering around the Capitol. And then later, suddenly he speaks well in behalf of his client in this election contest. Well, one of the things that he would have been doing as he was wandering around the Capitol is he could have walked up to the clerk's table in the House of Burgesses and read all of the committee protests against the Stamp Act that the Committee of Correspondence had been sending to its to its agent in London. So yeah, he was in terms of writing those resolutions, he was thoroughly immersed in the Virginia arguments and put them forward succinctly and eloquently, but really with no claim to to complete originality. Having said that, original thought in politics is overrated. Because if you're too original, nobody knows what the hell you're talking about. So you've got to make arguments that are familiar. I would argue, in fact, that when Jefferson opposes British measures in the Summary View, which is published in 1774. Jefferson has all kind of weird arguments going back to Wittgemütz and stuff from the ancient Saxons, and I can imagine people in the General Assembly going, "Yeah, that's cool, but we're not going to pass that." But,
anyone else have a question? Yes, sir. This right over there.
So John, if I recall correctly, part of the reason Henry got out of politics in 1792 was because he wanted to spend more time with his family. And I was wondering, it seems like such a big contrast between him and Jefferson and Washington, is that he was really a family man. He had a very large family, if I remember correctly. So it's
17 children.
Yeah, it's a pretty good start. Right there. Can you talk a little bit more about the role his family played in his life?
Yeah, it's one of the things that when you read the commentaries of all of this generation, they will protest that what they most want to do is go back to their plantations and just sit under our. I mean, one of they love the vine and the fig, sit under my own fig tree and all this stuff. But that doesn't sit well with some of them who are really very ambitious. I think the best exemplar of real commitment to family is Henry's good friend George Mason, who could not wait to get the hell out of Dodge and get back to Gunston Hall, and would be dragged kicking and screaming to come to the legislature because he just didn't like to be here with a bunch of idiots. Henry similarly, I mean, and Pendleton. In the legislative session that passes the Stamp Act resolutions, Pendleton wasn't there because he left early. Henry left, and as a result, they were able the next day to rescind it. A lot of these guys basically wanted to get back home. It's expensive to live in Williamsburg. They got a per diem, but they'd much rather be back home and on their plantations. We have some, Henry. Two things happened to the documentary record that have been a challenge for Henry. Well, three, I suppose. One is that he was an orator, so we don't have that because it's just lost in space somewhere. Maybe the Mars things will pick it up far enough away from Earth. But another thing is, of course, in the Civil War, Hanover sent its records here to Richmond for safekeeping, which was really cool until the last day of the evacuation of the city when they burned. And then the other thing is that Henry's descendants built an expanded house down at Red Hill, and it burned in 1919. So there's lots of family stuff that clearly may have been there in the early years of the 20th century, but that have since been lost. But what we do have is some stories about people coming to the plantation and finding Henry out rolling in the grass with his sons and goofing off and stuff like that. And, he seems to have been just a decent guy in a lot of different ways. If you're interested in the subject of not only Henry but the other founders as fathers, Laurie Glover has written a book a couple of years ago that basically is entitled, I think, something like "The Founders as Fathers," that really deals very nicely with that. But his goal in terms of his children, one of the things that he tried to do and was fairly successful was to make sure that his daughters had dowries and his sons had land. Well,
John, when you and I were young, and most of the other people in this room were young, everything about Patrick Henry posed a puzzle. Here was the great man who led the revolution against the king, created the American Republic, and then opposed the Constitution that made the Republic work. I mean, that's not the way the story goes, but that's the way we learned the story. We can't get away from here without you talking about Henry's opposition to the Constitution.
yeah. Henry would happen to be governor of Virginia when Congress was arguing over the treaty that they hoped could be negotiated with Spain. And so John Jay was supposed to negotiate a treaty with Diego de Gardequi, the Spanish representative. And basically they went on and on and on and on in their attempt to negotiate basically a trade treaty. And the Spanish kept insisting on closing the Mississippi. And the Americans, basically because Virginia believed in the importance of the Ohio River and Kentucky's interest in navigation in the Mississippi, they believed in, this is actually going to have a point, I'm sorry. But they were committed to retaining Americans' use of the Mississippi. So anyway, this negotiation goes on and on and on and on. And at some point, there's a bunch of New Englanders who basically try to change Jay's instructions to allow him to give up navigation of the Mississippi River. James Monroe is in Congress as this is happening and writes to the governor, who happens to be Patrick Henry, saying, hey, holy crap, this is what's going on. It's really dangerous. This is really horrible. And I think that plants a seed of doubt in Henry's mind as to whether or not the New Englanders can be trusted. And then within a very short time, of course, you get the movement toward the creation of a stronger central government. And now Henry's going into this with a doubt. And I see that episode as changing his attitude. The reason I see it is because we know in 1785, in a coffee house somewhere in Richmond, Henry approached James Madison and said basically, you know, we need, I mean, the Congress needs more resources. It needs more revenue. You draw something up and I'll support it on the floor and we'll do this. So he was not, at that point, 1785, he was not, unsympathetic to the needs of the national government. But I think he was really soured by the way in which the New Englanders seem to be pulling a fast one at the expense of Virginia's interest. And I think that plays into his suspicion of the whole movement toward the writing of the Constitution. And so then in September 17th, 1787, the convention rises in Philadelphia, promulgates this new document. Washington sends a copy to Henry, hoping that Henry will like it. And Henry writes back to Washington and says, you know, I wish I could, but I can't bring myself to be in agreement about this. And the more he looks at it, the more he sees it as being inimical to Virginia's interests. And he's wary about the transfer of powers as he sees it to the federal government. He's very, very wary about the powers of taxation that are going to be given to the federal government. And part of what I've got to say in the book is kind of new stuff on that subject, because he sees implications in the power of taxation that that he sees far-reaching political implications in the power of taxation. Give you a quick example. Henry, from his experience as a legislator, says if you give people the power of taxing, what they're going to try to do is they're going to try to make sure that the other guy's stuff gets taxed. And so if we give the federal government the power of taxation, these bad guys who are going to give away the Mississippi River, they're going to try to make sure that the South gets taxed on things that the North doesn't have. That's just the natural workings of politics. There's nothing nefarious about it, just the natural workings of politics. And so he sees in that, among other things, a real threat to slavery. Slavery is an awful thing. And in fact, the argument that he makes is slavery is so repugnant, it's so evil, it's so horrible, that as soon as the legislatures of the rest of the country get a chance, they're going to go, oh my God, this is terrible, let's tax it out of existence. Well, basically, Henry argues for a middle ground, which the Virginia legislature recommends, which is basically that what they want to do is they want to pass an amendment to the Constitution that would allow Congress to say, all right, we need X amount of dollars from Virginia. And then Virginia would raise the money as they saw fit, as would Massachusetts, Vermont, Rhode Island, whoever, turn it over to Congress. And only if the state failed to deliver the money would the central government have the opportunity to intervene in the state and with any form of direct taxation. So that's what he was really pushing for. And of course he and George Mason were both very, very dismayed when that particular proposed amendment from the Virginia Convention went nowhere. Madison was very careful to take all of the proposed amendments from the various conventions and draw up a Bill of Rights that as Henry and a lot of his contemporaries thought was just as Ken Bowling says, a tub to the whale. But Henry, so Henry opposed ratification. I argue in the book, not because he wanted to set up Virginia as separate or because he wanted to set up a Southern Confederacy, but rather that by opposing it, it strengthened his hands in terms of negotiating for the kinds of changes that he wanted to see written into the Constitution. Ultimately, they lost by 10 votes in the Virginia Convention of June 1788. At the end of the convention, a bunch of disgruntled people, led principally by George Mason, got together in the new Capitol to talk about essentially resistance. And they invited Henry to come and speak to them, and Henry said, ladies and gentlemen, we've argued this argument in the proper constitutional place. We lost, it's time to go home. And one of the things that you see in Henry's career at several different points is that he went with the majority, even if he was outvoted. He went with the majority rule. It counted for something. Then, of course, in the legislature, he played real hardball with Madison, and there's no question that he played hardball with Madison. He kept Madison from becoming one of our first senators, and instead sent the legislature sent Richard Henry Lee and William Grayson, two staunch anti-federalists, to the Senate, and he did his best to make sure that Madison had a damn difficult time getting into Congress. Madison at the time was in New York with the Continental Congress, and really preferred not to have to come back to campaign in Virginia. Partially because he had hemorrhoids, and transportation at that day, I can see how that would be a consideration. But so Henry, there's a mistaken impression out there that Henry and the legislature somehow gerrymandered the districts. That's really not the case, and has been pretty much shown not to be the case. But they did pass requirement that congressmen had to be residents of their district, because Henry didn't want to have Madison be able to go down to Tidewater somewhere where there were a bunch of Federalists and walk into Congress easily that way. So, so as it happened in those first elections, Madison and Monroe faced off. Monroe had voted against the Constitution, had been an anti-federalist, a moderate anti-federalist in the convention. So the two of them faced off. And one of the things, Madison, first of all, had to, despite the pain of the carriage ride, had to come down from New York and come home and campaign, and basically had to promise his constituents that he would push for a Bill of Rights. And then on that basis, he was able to edge Monroe out for a seat in Congress. And to be absolutely fair to Madison, he did push for a Bill of Rights when a lot of people in Congress thought it was just an empty exercise, and ultimately he pushed it through and got it ratified a few years later. But yeah, Henry was adamant in his opposition to ratifying the Constitution. And then one of the things I know that the Library of Virginia hauls out, takes across the street every 4 years is the first document from Virginia's electors in Washington's first election as president, when the Electoral College met. And Henry was the elector from his district, and as probably the senior man in the Electoral College that met from Virginia, he's the one who signed the document first. So there's no question that once the Constitution was adopted, he basically fell in line and upheld it as he. So there's none of that sort of lingering, antipathy toward it or something. But he played hardball politics with Madison. Madison is, of course, he's a great intellect and much admired by American historians and lawyers and political scientists. But I think that the Madison that Henry was dealing with at this time, and you'll notice if you look at the pictures that I've chosen for the book, I found one of Madison in the 1780s, and he looks like a 12-year-old. And I think there's a lot of evidence, I think, of Madison in the 1780s where he's just like infatuated with ideas in ways that must have just sent Henry bonkers, because Henry was pretty practical in Madison. Anyway, does that get at what you were hoping for?
All right,
No, wait.
one more question, and then we need to wrap up.
I just wanted, doesn't the Library of Virginia have some of Patrick Henry's law books from his saddlebags?
Yes.
Well, isn't that fabulous?
There's some here, and I saw Bill Martin earlier. Valentine has a few. Yeah, they're around. And I mentioned it earlier, but if you're interested, there's a really terrific book about Henry's. It's called The Mind of a Patriot by Kevin Hayes, which came out of, I don't know, about 5-6 years ago. It's a really terrific book about Henry and his mind and his library, and identifies what was in the library and where they are.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for coming out. Please do join us for the book signing. Fill out your card so we know how you heard about the program. One more time, please. Well, give a big hand to John. And also to Sarah for a very insightful interview. Thank you very much.